Welcome to Top 10 Secret, where chilling secrets and eerie ghost stories lurking in the shadows will make you think twice before turning off the lights at night. Are you ready to face your fears? Story 1. Witching Hour. The dark, oppressive silence of the night was shattered at exactly 3 a.m. when Sarah bolted upright in her bed. Her breath came in short, frantic gasps as though she had been running in her sleep. The air in the room was icy, far colder than it should have been for a midsummer night. The old grandfather clock in the hall ticked away the seconds, its deep chime marking the ominous arrival of what her grandmother used to call the witching hour. Sarah lived alone in a creaking, century-old Victorian house on the outskirts of a small town in Massachusetts. The house had belonged to her family for generations, and stories of hauntings had always been dismissed as mere folklore. But lately, Sarah had begun waking up at this same time every night, her heart pounding as though something unseen was watching her. Tonight was different. Tonight, she felt the presence. She turned her head slowly, her eyes scanning the shadows in the corners of her bedroom. The dim light of the moon filtered through the lace curtains, casting eerie patterns on the floor. Her eyes locked onto the large mirror hanging on the far wall. For a moment, it seemed like her reflection was delayed, moving slower than it should. A faint, guttural whisper filled the air. It was unintelligible, yet it felt like it was meant for her. Sarah's blood ran cold as the whisper grew louder, more insistent. She clutched the blankets tighter around her, paralyzed with fear. The voice seemed to emanate from the mirror, drawing her gaze back to it. Sarah. Her name was spoken softly, but with a chilling clarity that made her skin crawl. The reflection in the mirror began to shift. Her own face stared back at her, but the eyes were wrong, empty, hollow, and filled with a malevolence she couldn't comprehend. The figure in the mirror began to grin, a grotesque, unnatural smile that stretched far beyond human limits. "Who's there?" Sarah managed to whisper, her voice trembling. The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it lifted a hand and pressed it against the inside of the glass. A dark, shadowy substance began to ooze from the corners of the mirror, dripping onto the floor. The smell of decay filled the room, and Sarah gagged, covering her mouth and nose. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her, coming from every direction. She could make out fragmented phrases. "She knows. The house. The debt must be paid." Unable to bear it any longer, Sarah leapt out of bed and fled the room. As she ran down the narrow hallway, the air seemed to thicken, pressing against her like an unseen force trying to hold her back. The house groaned and creaked as though it were alive, protesting her every step. She reached the staircase and froze. At the bottom stood a figure cloaked in darkness, its outline barely discernible against the faint glow of the streetlight outside. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its long, bony fingers reached out toward her. "You cannot leave," it rasped, its voice echoing through her mind rather than her ears. "The house remembers." Sarah stumbled backward, nearly tripping over her own feet. She turned to flee back to her bedroom, but the door slammed shut before she could reach it. The whispers were now deafening, chanting her name over and over as if the house itself was calling her. Panicked, Sarah darted into the nearest room, the old study where her family's history was stored. She slammed the door shut and pushed a heavy desk in front of it. Her trembling hands fumbled for the chain on the overhead light, and the dim bulb flickered to life. On the desk was an ancient journal bound in cracked leather. It wasn't hers, and she had never seen it before. With shaking fingers, she opened it to the first page. The handwriting was her grandmother's, but the words were chilling. "The house is cursed. We made a pact long ago, and the debt has yet to be paid. It will come for the youngest of us when the clock strikes 3. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as the pieces fell into place. Her family had hidden the truth, passing the house down through the generations, knowing what it demanded. And now it was her turn. The whispers ceased abruptly. The silence was even more terrifying. She felt it before she saw it. A cold, skeletal hand resting on her shoulder. Slowly, she turned her head, and the last thing she saw was the grinning face of the reflection from the mirror, now standing before her in the flesh. The house grew silent once more, and the grandfather clock chimed the arrival of 4 a.m. Outside, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the darkness, but inside the house, Sarah was gone. All that remained was the journal, lying open on the desk with a new entry scrawled in blood-red ink. The debt is paid. For now. If you'd like more suspenseful details or deeper character insights, let me know. Story 2. The Curse of Sadako Yamamura. That night, the storm roared like the cries of thousands of forgotten souls. In a decrepit wooden house by the shores of Izumo, Shizuko Yamamura clutched her stomach in pain. Her daughter, Sadako, was about to be born amidst nature's fury. Lightning slashed across the sky, illuminating Shizuko's face, a mixture of terror and agony. This was no ordinary child. Shizuko knew deep within her soul that this child would carry a horrifying darkness. Shizuko had once been a celebrated psychic, but her gift brought neither fame nor fortune, only disaster. After a disastrous performance, she was accused of fraud and pelted with stones, mocked as a modern-day witch. In her despair, Shizuko sought solace in a mysterious cave near the shore, rumored to be a place where the human world and supernatural beings intersect. There, she encountered a strange entity, believed by some to be a sea deity, though the truth might have been far more sinister. The child was born amidst Shizuko's screams and the eerie silence of the sea. When Sadako opened her eyes, they were deep, black voids that reflected no light. Shizuko knew then that this child was not entirely human. Sadako grew up in complete isolation. Whenever she stepped outside, the village children would scatter, whispering that she was a demon. Even adults avoided her, their faces pale with fear. But what terrified them most was not her haunting gaze, but the strange occurrences that followed her. Once, while playing in the forest near her home, a boy threw a rock at her, mocking her as a monster. Sadako said nothing, only staring at him with her hollow eyes. That night, the boy died suddenly, his face twisted as if being strangled by an invisible hand. Rumors about Sadako spread, branding her as a living curse. Every night, Sadako would stand before the mirror, staring at her reflection. She began hearing whispers, voices that seemed to come from another world. Sometimes, her face in the mirror would change, transforming into something inhuman, a dark, vengeful shadow. As Sadako entered her teenage years, Shizuko could no longer bear the pressure from the villagers. The rumors, the hateful stares, and her own fear of her daughter pushed her to the brink of madness. In a moment of despair, Shizuko threw herself into the sea, leaving Sadako alone in a world that despised her. Sadako was sent to live with a distant grandmother in a remote village. But soon, tragedy struck. During a village meeting where the residents discussed the demon child, a man dragged Sadako into the center of the crowd. He accused her of being the cause of all the mysterious deaths and misfortunes in the village. No one listened to her pleas, and no one dared to defend her. They dragged Sadako to an old well deep in the forest. "If you're truly a demon, this well will imprison you forever," one man shouted. Sadako struggled and screamed in desperation, but her powers were no match for the frenzied mob. They threw her into the well, sealed it shut, and left her to die in the cold, dark void. But Sadako did not die, at least not entirely. In the suffocating darkness, she gasped for air, her frail hands clawing at the walls of the well, searching for escape. As time passed, her fear turned into hatred. That hatred grew, becoming a supernatural force that transcended death itself. Decades later, a group of explorers accidentally stumbled upon the old well. When they removed the cover, a chilling gust of air rose, carrying Sadako's darkness and fury. From that moment, the curse began to spread. Strange videotapes surfaced, containing haunting images of terror and death. Anyone who watched the tape would receive a phone call immediately after, with a cold, hollow voice whispering, "7 days." Over the next 7 days, their fear would consume them. On the final night, Sadako would appear, crawling out of their screen, her long hair obscuring her face. No one survived to tell the full tale, but the distorted faces of the victims bore witness to the unimaginable torment they had endured. It is said that the only way to break the curse is to copy the tape and show it to someone else. But this act only makes the viewer complicit in spreading the darkness. Sadako cannot be stopped. She is the embodiment of pain and an unquenchable thirst for vengeance. A paranormal researcher, Dr. Takashi, dedicated his life to studying Sadako. He discovered that within this vengeful spirit, there remained a fragment of the girl Sadako once was, a lost soul yearning for release. But how to free her without succumbing to the curse remained a mystery even to Takashi. Sadako continues to haunt the world, an unstoppable force of darkness. Her story serves as a chilling reminder. Forgotten pain and abandoned souls can transform into an uncontrollable wrath. And on a rainy night, as you sit before your screen, remember to check the reflections around you. Perhaps, in the shadows, Sadako is watching. And if you hear soft footsteps behind you, do not turn around. It might be the last thing you ever do. Story 3. The Shadow in the Woods. It began with a whisper, a faint sound that barely stirred the stillness of the forest. The town of Black Hollow had long been surrounded by myths and eerie stories, but none as chilling as the one about the shadow that roamed the woods. Most dismissed it as folklore, a story to keep children from wandering too far. But those who ventured too deep often returned changed, or didn't return at all. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl. Sarah McAllister, a young journalist known for her investigative fervor, stood at the edge of the woods. She had heard the stories, of course. Everyone in Black Hollow had. But Sarah was different. She thrived on proving myths wrong, uncovering the mundane truths behind them. Armed with her camera, flashlight, and a notebook, she decided to spend a night in the forest to debunk the legend of the shadow. As she stepped into the dense woods, the air seemed to thicken. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining like skeletal fingers. The path ahead grew darker with each step, the flashlight's beam barely penetrating the shadows. She shook off the unease creeping up her spine. "It's just a story," she muttered to herself, her voice sounding hollow in the vast emptiness. Hours passed, and nothing out of the ordinary happened. Sarah recorded her thoughts, documenting the eerie but explainable sounds of the forest. Around midnight, she set up camp near a clearing. The moonlight cast an ethereal glow, and for a moment, everything seemed calm. But then, the whispering began. At first, it was faint, like the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze. But it grew louder, more insistent. Sarah turned in circles, her flashlight darting through the darkness. "Hello," she called, her voice trembling. There was no answer, only the whispering, which now seemed to come from every direction. Suddenly, the beam of her flashlight caught movement. A shadow, tall, formless, and unnervingly fluid, slithered between the trees. Her breath hitched as she aimed the camera, but the lens refused to focus. The shadow moved closer, and with it came a chilling cold that seeped into her bones. "Who's there?" she demanded, though her voice wavered. The shadow paused, its shape shifting as if deciding whether to approach. And then, it vanished. Determined to understand what she had seen, Sarah stayed in the woods, though every fiber of her being screamed at her to leave. As dawn broke, she stumbled upon something unexpected: the ruins of an old cabin, hidden behind a thick curtain of ivy. The door creaked as she pushed it open, revealing a dusty interior filled with decayed furniture and faded photographs. One photograph caught her eye. It was of a man and a young girl standing in front of the cabin, their expressions solemn. Scribbled on the back was a name: Eliza, 1937. Sarah's curiosity deepened. Who was Eliza, and what had happened here? Returning to town, Sarah began digging through old records. She learned that the cabin had belonged to a man named Thomas Grayson, a reclusive widower. His daughter Eliza had disappeared one stormy night, never to be found. Locals whispered that Thomas had gone mad with grief, claiming he had seen her ghost in the woods, calling out to him. He'd vanished soon after, leaving only the crumbling cabin behind. Sarah's discovery fueled her resolve. She returned to the woods, this time prepared to stay as long as it took to uncover the truth. She retraced her steps to the clearing where she'd first seen the shadow. As night fell, the whispers returned, louder and more coherent. "Help me." The voice was unmistakably that of a child. Sarah's heart pounded as she followed the sound, which led her deeper into the forest. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches clawing at her jacket. The cold grew unbearable, and her flashlight began to flicker. She stumbled into another clearing and froze. There, standing in the pale moonlight, was a little girl in a white dress, her hair matted and her face obscured by shadows. "Eliza?" Sarah whispered. The girl's head tilted slowly, unnaturally, as if she had heard her name for the first time in decades. "Help me," she repeated, her voice hollow. Before Sarah could respond, the girl dissolved into the shadow, which surged forward with a predatory speed. Sarah screamed and ran, her flashlight clattering to the ground behind her. In her frantic escape, Sarah tripped over something solid. Looking down, she realized it was a grave marker, half buried and weathered by time. The name Eliza Grayson was etched into the stone. Beneath it, a chilling epitaph read, "She was taken by the darkness." The shadow loomed behind her, its presence suffocating. But as it advanced, Sarah's instincts kicked in. She pulled out her camera and took a photo, the flash briefly illuminating the dark figure. For a split second, she thought she saw a face, twisted and anguished, before the shadow recoiled and vanished into the night. Sarah fled the woods and never returned. She published her findings, complete with the haunting photograph, which showed a faint outline of a face within the shadow. Her story captivated readers, but many dismissed it as a clever hoax. But Sarah knew the truth. The shadow was real, a malevolent force tied to Eliza's tragic fate. And though she escaped, she couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow wasn't confined to the woods. At night, in the corners of her room, she sometimes saw it watching, waiting. The story of Black Hollow's shadow became legend, a tale to scare children and thrill seekers. But Sarah's warning was clear. Some myths are real, and some shadows are more than darkness. They are a hunger, an echo of something unspeakable, and they never truly let go. Story 4. Darkness in the Abandoned House. Emily was a freelance writer, renowned for her chilling horror stories. One day, she received an anonymous email with a cryptic message. "I know you're always seeking inspiration. If you want to know what true fear is, come to house number 13 on Huang Hoa Tam Street. A story awaits you." Emily wasn't one to easily believe in vague notions, but her curiosity drove her to check out the address mentioned. The abandoned house was tucked away in a narrow alley with an old, eerie appearance. Broken window panes, vines wrapped around the walls like dry fingers choking the house. Though no one had lived there for decades, the house oddly had not collapsed. Emily stepped inside, her flashlight trembling as it illuminated the moldy, stained walls. The creaking door closed behind her, creating an ominous echo in the silent space. "Who sent me that email?" she muttered. But there was no answer. After exploring dusty, barren rooms filled only with broken furniture, Emily stumbled upon a hidden door beneath an old carpet. The trapdoor revealed a steep staircase, the damp smell hitting her senses hard. Emily hesitated, but eventually decided to descend. The basement was a space dimly lit by flickering candles. On the walls, crude hand-drawn pictures depicted distorted faces, their blood-red eyes glaring directly at Emily. "Welcome," a voice suddenly spoke. Emily spun around in shock. Standing before her was a woman in an unsettling white dress, her face pale, her eyes hauntingly vacant, as if she wasn't looking at Emily but through her. Who are you?" Emily stammered, clutching her flashlight tightly with trembling hands. "I am the one who will tell you the most terrifying story of your life." "Why should I believe you?" The woman gave a faint smile and then slowly disappeared into a swirl of black smoke. After the woman vanished, Emily noticed an old journal placed on a table. She opened it, and jagged, scrawled writing leapt off the pages. "We were wrong to summon that thing. It has died, but it will never leave. Those who see it will never escape." At that moment, a loud, jarring knock echoed from upstairs. "Who's there?" Emily shouted, though she knew no one would answer. Footsteps dragged across the wooden floor above, as if something was crushing the atmosphere around her. She crept back towards the basement, clutching the journal like it was her only weapon. The basement grew more suffocating, cold and dark. She could hear faint whispers in the shadows, like the cries of someone imprisoned. She stepped forward. Another door appeared. It was closed, yet somehow beckoned her to open it. Emily, trembling, approached and touched the handle. The door flung open as though a black hole were pulling her in. Story 5. The Haunted Mattress. That winter, my family moved into an old house on the outskirts of the city. The house had been abandoned for many years, exuding an eerie and strange aura. We didn't have much money, so all the furniture we purchased was secondhand. My mother bought a mattress from a thrift store. It looked fairly new on the outside, but once it was placed in my younger brother's room, none of us could have foreseen the horrifying events it would bring. It started within the first week of moving in. My younger brother, Tuan, began having nightmares. At first, we didn't think much of it, assuming it was just the stress of adjusting to a new environment. But then, his nightmares worsened. Tuan often woke up in the middle of the night, his face pale and drenched in sweat. He told us about a recurring dream where an old woman, frail and distorted, with milky white eyes, stood in the corner of his room, staring at him. She never said a word, but her gaze pierced through him. Whenever he tried to close his eyes, she would creep closer and closer until he could feel her icy breath on his neck. At first, I thought he was just a child with an overactive imagination. But what happened next changed my mind. One night, Tuan begged to sleep in my room because he no longer dared to sleep in his own bed. I laughed it off, calling him a scaredy cat. To prove it was all in his head, I decided to sleep on his bed that night. That night, the room was unnaturally silent. I lay on the bed and felt an inexplicable chill despite the windows being tightly shut. A strange sensation washed over me, as if someone were standing in the corner of the room watching me. I forced myself to close my eyes, telling myself it was all in my head. But just as I started to drift off, a faint moaning sound echoed from somewhere in the room. I opened my eyes wide. The darkness was suffocating, but I was certain I hadn't imagined the sound. The moaning grew louder, stretching on as if someone was in unbearable pain. My heart pounded in my chest, and cold sweat ran down my back. I turned on the bedside lamp, but the room was empty. No one was there. I lay back down, trying to fall asleep again, but the feeling returned. A sudden, icy breeze swept over me, and this time, I heard footsteps. They were soft, like someone treading lightly on the old wooden floorboards. The footsteps stopped right beside the bed. I didn't dare open my eyes, but I knew something was standing there, right next to me. Suddenly, I felt an icy hand touch my leg. I shot up, screaming. The room was still empty, but I knew what I had felt was real. The next day, I told my mother about what had happened. At first, she didn't believe me, but after seeing how frightened Tuan and I were, she decided to investigate the mattress. A friend of hers who worked at the thrift store revealed that the mattress had once belonged to an elderly woman who lived alone in a small apartment. She had passed away on that very mattress, and her body wasn't discovered until weeks later. Horrifically, her decomposing body had seeped into the mattress. We immediately threw the mattress out, but the nightmare didn't end there. Even after the mattress was gone, the strange occurrences continued. Tuan began seeing the old woman's shadow around the house, especially in dark corners or reflected in mirrors. I too started having nightmares, in which she stood at the foot of my bed, her grotesque smile frozen on her face. One night, while the family was having dinner, we heard strange noises coming from Tuan's room. Scratching sounds like someone clawing at the door. When we rushed in, the room was empty, but the window was wide open even though we were certain it had been locked. A cold wind blew in, carrying with it a foul, rotting smell. My mother called in a spiritual healer. He said the old woman's spirit couldn't accept that we had invaded her space. He performed a cleansing ritual, but just as it ended, a piercing scream echoed through the house. It was filled with rage and hatred, chilling us to the bone. After that night, everything seemed to quiet down, but I knew the old woman's spirit still lingered, hiding in the shadows. Every night, I could feel her gaze, cold, unyielding, and full of malice, watching me from the corners of the room. And I knew that even though the mattress was gone, the horror it brought would never truly leave us. If you're ever thinking about buying secondhand furniture, be cautious. You never know what kind of terrifying secrets it might carry from its past.